What happens when a man builds his entire world on a foundation of lies and arrogance? Richard Sterling thought he had it all, a thriving business, a beautiful young mistress on his arm, and the respect of the elite. He chose the most public place imaginable, the exclusive Coronado Bay Yacht Club, to flaunt his new life, convinced his ex-wife, Amelia, was a forgotten chapter, left with nothing. But he made one colossal miscalculation. He never imagined she would return, not as a ghost of the past, but as the master of her own destiny, arriving in a machine that screamed more power and wealth than he could ever dream of. Stay with us as we unfold the story of how one woman's quiet comeback caused a Titan's spectacular fall. Richard Sterling surveyed the scene from the deck of the Coronado Bay Yacht Club with the satisfaction of a king reviewing his domain. The late afternoon sun, a benevolent gold, glinted off the chrome fittings of the multi-million-dollar yachts bobbing gently in the marina. The air smelled of salt money and a particular brand of Californian exceptionalism. It was, in his opinion, the smell of victory. On his arm, Chloe Summers was a perfect accessory. 24 years old, with hair the color of champagne and eyes the blue of a shallow sea. She was a living, breathing testament to his success. She was youth beauty, and most importantly, she was not Amelia. Every laugh that tinkled from her lips every time she squeezed his arm and looked up at him with manufactured adoration was a jab at the memory of his ex-wife. "Isn't it just divine, Ricky?" Chloe murmured, gesturing with her champagne flute towards the horizon, where Catalina Island was a hazy silhouette. "It's ours, baby." "Richard," said his voice, a low, proprietary rumble. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. It was a performance, and the members of the yacht club were his audience. He caught the eye of Michael Caldwell, a rival in the commercial real estate game, and gave him a curt, confident nod. Caldwell's wife, Patricia, offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They were all watching. They always were. For Richard, life was a game of perception. It wasn't enough to be successful. One had to be seen as successful. His divorce from Amelia had been messy, a strategic campaign he had waged with ruthless efficiency. He'd painted her as unstable, grasping a woman who couldn't keep up with his ambition. His lawyers, a pack of sharks from a top-tier Los Angeles firm, had systematically dismantled her claims, leaving her with a settlement that was in their circles an insult. Just enough to keep her from being destitute, but not enough to maintain anything close to the life she had known. He had wanted her to disappear, to fade into the obscurity he felt she deserved. He had built Sterling Enterprises from a modest inheritance and a great deal of nerve into a significant player in West Coast development. But he was new money, and the old money denizens of Coronado Bay never let him forget it. They tolerated him because his ventures were profitable and his parties were lavish, but he always sensed their condescension, their quiet judgment. Marrying Amelia Hayes, a woman from a respectable, if not extraordinarily wealthy family, had been a strategic move. She had given him a veneer of class, a social grace he inherently lacked. She had hosted the dinners, remembered the names of the children of his business partners, and smoothed over his rougher edges with her quiet elegance. For 15 years, she had been the perfect corporate wife. She'd put her own career in art history on hold, managed their homes in Newport and Aspen, and raised their 2 children, who were now safely ensconced in expensive East Coast boarding schools. She had been the silent partner in the construction of his empire. And in the end, he had treated her like a redundant employee, casting her aside for a newer, shinier model. "I'm going to get another drink," he said to Chloe, bestowing a perfunctory kiss on her temple. "Don't move," she smiled prettily. "I won't." He made his way to the outdoor bar, his gait a carefully cultivated swagger. He ordered a Macallan 25 neat. The price was obscene, but that was the point. As the bartender poured the amber liquid, Richard's mind drifted back to Amelia. He pictured her in the small condo he knew she had rented in a less fashionable part of Orange County. He imagined her surrounded by boxes, her face etched with worry, probably reheating a frozen dinner. The image pleased him. It validated his decision. He had cut away the dead weight, and now he was soaring. He thought of her attempts during the divorce proceedings to claim a larger stake in the company. She'd argued that her contributions, her emotional labor and social networking had been integral to its growth. His lawyers had scoffed, and the judge, an old-guard conservative, had sided with Richard. Business was business, and Amelia's name wasn't on the paperwork. "A beautiful day for it, Sterling," a voice boomed beside him. It was Bob Patterson, a retired tech mogul with a face like a well-worn leather briefcase. "They're all beautiful days now, Bob," Richard replied, raising his glass in a mock toast. Patterson chuckled, his gaze drifting over to where Chloe was now taking a selfie, pouting her lips at her phone. "I see you're enjoying your retirement from marriage." "Freedom is a valuable commodity," Richard said smoothly, though he disliked Patterson's tone. It was a little too knowing. "Indeed it is. So is loyalty. My Brenda and I 40 years next June." "Can you imagine?" "No," Richard said, his voice flatter than he intended. He turned away from Patterson, his good mood slightly punctured. He hated the subtle digs, the reminders that he was still an outsider. He scanned the club, the clusters of people in their crisp linens and pastel polos. This was his world now. He had paid for his entry in cash and in sacrifice. He would not be made to feel inadequate. He looked back at Chloe. She was now talking to a young, handsome tennis pro who worked at the club. There was an easy familiarity in their posture, a shared language of youth and beauty that Richard at 52 could only rent, never truly own. A flicker of insecurity, hot and unwelcome, coursed through him. He quickly suppressed it. Chloe was with him. She understood the arrangement. Her lifestyle was contingent on his generosity. He drained his scotch and walked back to her, deliberately inserting himself between her and the tennis pro. He placed a possessive hand on the small of her back. "Darling," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "let's go for a walk down the pier. I want to check on the sterling silver." His yacht, a sleek 70-foot azimuth, was his pride and joy. It was another symbol, another declaration of his status. As they walked, his arm firmly around Chloe's waist, he felt his equilibrium return, the envy in the eyes of the men they passed, the admiring glances at Chloe. This was his fuel. He was Richard Sterling. He had won. He had everything he had ever wanted. The past was a foreign country, and he had burned the passport. He was untouchable. He was so wrapped up in his own narrative of triumph that he didn't notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. He didn't see the way conversations on the deck began to falter, the way heads started to turn, not towards him, but towards the club's entrance. He didn't hear the sound at first, a low, guttural growl that was slowly building in intensity, a sound entirely alien to the gentle lapping of the waves and the polite chatter of the afternoon. It was the sound of something powerful, something expensive, and something new, and it was heading their way. While Richard was basking in the artificial glow of his new life, Amelia Hayes was rediscovering the forgotten contours of her own. The first 6 months after the divorce were a descent into a grey, featureless hell. The life she had meticulously curated for 2 decades had been liquidated, packed into boxes, and stripped away from her. The sprawling Newport Beach villa, with its ocean views, was gone. The charity boards she sat on politely informed her that her position was contingent on her marriage to Richard. The friends they had shared, couples she had hosted for countless dinners, suddenly became very busy, their calendars mysteriously full whenever she tried to reach out. She was left in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the periphery of a life she was no longer entitled to. The settlement Richard had so begrudgingly provided was a cruel joke. After legal fees, it was enough to secure a modest 2-bedroom condo in Irvine, a city whose primary virtue was its beige, inoffensive safety. The sprawling, sun-drenched coast was now a place she visited no longer. A place she lived. For weeks, she did little more than unpack boxes, each one a fresh assault of memory. A photo of her and Richard, in Tuscany, smiling years before the cracks in his ambition had fractured his soul. Her children's elementary school art projects. The guest book from their wedding. She moved through the small rooms of her new home like a stranger, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whine of the freeway. Richard's parting words echoed in her mind. "You're nothing without me, Amelia. You were a project, and I've moved on to a new development." The cruelty of it was a physical weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. There were days she didn't get out of bed, the curtains drawn, against a world that felt too bright, too loud, too full of people who were moving forward, while she was stuck in the wreckage of her past. She mourned not just the loss of her marriage, but the loss of herself. The woman who had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in art history, the woman who had once dreamed of curating a major museum exhibit, had been slowly eroded over the years, subsumed by the all-consuming demands of being Mrs. Richard Sterling. The turning point came not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a quiet, stubborn refusal to break. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting on her small balcony, staring at the stucco wall of the building opposite, when she realized the tears had finally stopped. She felt a profound emptiness, a void where the pain had been. And into that void, a new feeling began to seep: anger. Not the helpless, sobbing anger of a victim, but a cold, clear, clarifying rage. She got up, walked to her laptop, and opened a file she hadn't touched in 15 years, her master's thesis, a deep dive into the restoration of post-war European sports cars. It was a niche passion, one Richard had always dismissed as a cute hobby. He'd preferred she focus on more socially acceptable art forms, like collecting bland contemporary sculptures that did little more than appreciate in value. But Amelia had always loved the intersection of art and engineering, the soul of a machine the stories held within its chassis. She read her own words, and for the first time in a long time, she heard her own voice. It was intelligent, passionate, and confident. It was the voice of a woman she had almost forgotten. That night, she didn't order takeout. She cooked a simple meal for herself, opened a bottle of wine, and made a plan. The next morning, she enrolled in a certification program for classic car appraisal. The other students were mostly men, grease-stained gearheads and retired mechanics who looked at her with skepticism. But her knowledge, meticulously researched and passionately held, soon won their respect. She spent her weekends at car shows and auctions, not as a spectator, but as a student, absorbing every detail, building a network of contacts. She started a small consulting business from her condo, Hayes Heritage Automotive. Her first clients were small-time collectors, men who trusted her academic rigor and her keen eye. She helped them authenticate parts, research vehicle provenance, and prepare their cars for auction. Her work was precise, her integrity unimpeachable. Word began to spread through the tight-knit community of high-end car collectors. She wasn't just a consultant, she was a connoisseur. It was through this work that she met Damien Thorne. He wasn't just a billionaire, he was a legend in the tech world, a man who had built his empire on innovation and a genuine vision for the future, not on leveraged debt and hostile takeovers like Richard. He was also a passionate collector of vintage automobiles, but unlike the men who simply wrote checks, Damien understood the machines. He could talk about the nuances of a Weber carburetor or the specific racing history of a 1960s Ferrari with the same fluency he used to discuss quantum computing. He had sought her out after reading a monograph she had written on the preservation of original Zagato bodywork. He hadn't sent an assistant, he had called her himself. Their first meeting was at his private collection, a vast climate-controlled facility that looked more like a museum than a garage. He wasn't testing her. He was conversing with her, an equal. He listened, truly listened to her opinions. He valued her intellect. He was tall with a quiet intensity that was the polar opposite of Richard's loud bravado. His eyes, a startlingly clear grey, held a warmth and a deep-seated confidence that had no need for external validation. Their professional relationship blossomed into a friendship, and then slowly, organically, into something more. With Damien, Amelia felt seen. He wasn't interested in a trophy or a social accessory. He was fascinated by her mind, her passion, her resilience. He loved the woman she had become after her world had fallen apart, not the woman she had been when it was all intact. He never once spoke ill of Richard, but his quiet, unwavering support was the most powerful indictment of her ex-husband's character she could imagine. One evening, they were having dinner at his home in Laguna Beach, a stunning piece of modern architecture that seemed to float over the Pacific. He told her about a new acquisition, a car he had been pursuing for years, a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB4, one of only a handful ever made with a unique aluminum alloy body. It was a masterpiece of design and engineering. "It's being delivered next week," he said, his eyes sparkling with genuine excitement. "It's a bit ostentatious for my usual taste, but it's a piece of history, a work of art." "It's more than that," Amelia said, her mind already racing through its history. "It's a statement." Damien leaned forward, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Everything is in a way. The clothes we wear, the places we go, even the cars we drive." He paused, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know, the Coronado Bay Yacht Club is having their annual summer regatta party this Saturday. It's a dreadful affair, usually, full of posturing and gossip." Amelia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. That was Richard's stage, his favorite theater. "I have to make an appearance," Damien continued, his voice casual. "A few potential investors for my new philanthropic fund are members. I was going to fly in and out, but—" He looked at her, his grey eyes holding hers. "I was thinking we could make a bit more of an entrance. What do you say to taking the 275 for her maiden voyage? You, of course, will drive. I'm merely the passenger." Amelia's heart began to beat faster. It wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. Revenge was a hot, messy emotion, and what she felt now was a cool, crystalline sense of purpose. It was about closing a chapter. It was about showing up in the heart of her old life, not as a victim, but as the architect of a new one. It was about demonstrating in the most undeniable way possible that Richard Sterling hadn't broken her. He had inadvertently forged her. "I think," Amelia said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I would like that very much." The sound arrived first. It was a deep, resonant baritone that cut through the polite murmur of the yacht club. A sound so rich and complex, it seemed to have its own texture. It was nothing like the high-pitched shriek of a modern supercar. This was the sound of 12 meticulously tuned Italian cylinders, a mechanical symphony composed in Maranello a half-century ago. Heads turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. On the deck, Richard Sterling paused, a forkful of seared ahi halfway to Chloe's mouth. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the stucco walls of the clubhouse. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power, but it was also a sound of elegance. It spoke not of brute force, but of heritage and pedigree. It was the kind of sound that made men who owned 80-foot yachts feel suddenly and inexplicably inadequate. Then it appeared. It swept into the valet circle with the grace of a predator, a flash of brilliant, iconic red Rosso Corsa. It was the 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB4. Even to the untrained eye, it was obviously special. Its lines were fluid and sensual, a masterpiece of Pininfarina design, every curve and contour perfected by hand. The setting sun ignited its paint, making it look less like a car and more like a drop of molten lava. It radiated an aura of history, of Le Mans victories and moonlit drives along the Amalfi Coast. It made every other car in the lot, the Porsches, the Bentleys, the blacked-out Range Rovers, look common, like mass-produced appliances. A crowd began to gather instinctively along the railing of the deck, their champagne flutes forgotten. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. "My God, is that a 275? I haven't seen one of those outside of Pebble Beach in a decade. Who does that belong to? Must be worth 10, maybe 15 million. Look at the bodywork. Is that an alloy body? It has to be." Richard stood frozen, his eyes locked on the vehicle. He was a man who understood the hierarchy of things, and that car was a statement of such profound wealth and taste that it dwarfed his own carefully constructed image. He felt a prickle of sweat on his brow. He instinctively knew this car didn't belong to any of the club's regular members. This was a different echelon of power. He felt a desperate need to know who was inside. Was it a new tech billionaire? A foreign prince? A potential investor? He needed to court Chloe, oblivious to the nuances of automotive hierarchy, was simply impressed by the spectacle. "Wow! Ricky," she breathed. "That's a hot car. Do you know whose it is?" "No." Richard snapped, his irritation mounting. The attention of the entire club had been stolen from him. He was no longer the main event. The Ferrari's engine idled for a moment, a throaty burble that promised immense power held in reserve. Then it fell silent. The valet, a young man named Carlos, who was usually unflappable, approached the driver's side door with a reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. The door opened, not with a clunk, but with a light, precise click. A single leg emerged. It was clad in a slim-fitting, cream-colored linen trouser. A moment later, the driver stood up and turned to face the clubhouse. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the crowd on the deck. It was Amelia. She wasn't the Amelia of Richard's memory, the tear-streaked, defeated woman from the divorce lawyer's office. She wasn't the harried, heartbroken woman he pictured alone in her condo. The woman standing by the Ferrari was a stranger to him. Her blonde hair was cut in a chic, sophisticated bob that framed her face. She wore a simple, elegant silk blouse, the cream trousers and sunglasses that hid her eyes, but couldn't hide the serene, confident set of her jaw. She looked radiant, rested, and most unnervingly of all, happy. Richard's entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. His breath caught in his throat. His face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction moments before, went slack with disbelief. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. It felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. It was impossible. It made no sense. How could she be driving that car? Where did she get it? The questions hammered at the inside of his skull. Each one a blow to his carefully constructed reality. Chloe, seeing his reaction, was utterly bewildered. "Ricky, what is it? Who is that?" Richard couldn't speak. He could only stare, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and a dawning, terrifying sense of dread. He watched as Amelia handed the key fob to the stunned valet with a warm, easy smile. "Please be careful with her," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying up to the deck. "She's a grand old lady." Then the passenger door opened. If Amelia's appearance was a shock, what happened next was a seismic event that shattered the foundations of the Coronado Bay Yacht Club's social order. Damien Thorne unfolded himself from the low-slung car. He was instantly recognizable to most of the power players present. He was a titan, a man who didn't just play the game, but invented new ones. He was wearing a simple, dark polo shirt and chinos, yet he exuded more authority than every man in a bespoke suit on that deck combined. He walked around the front of the car, his eyes only for Amelia. He didn't grandstand or look for an audience. He gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over hers, and murmured something that made her laugh a genuine, unforced laugh that echoed across the stunned silence. The pieces clicked into place in Richard's mind with the force of a shotgun blast. The car, the billionaire, Amelia. It wasn't a coincidence. This was a calculated, deliberate act. This was a display of power so immense, so far beyond his own, that it made his entire life look like a cheap imitation. He felt a tremor start in his hands. The glass of scotch he had been holding slipped from his grasp, shattering on the teak deck, with a crash that sounded deafening in the sudden quiet. Amber liquid and shards of crystal spread across the wood, a perfect metaphor for the state of his composure. Chloe jumped back with a small shriek. "Richard, what is wrong with you?" But Richard didn't hear her. His eyes were locked on the scene below. He saw Michael Colwell, his rival, lean over and whisper something to his wife. He saw Bob Patterson, the man who had just lectured him on loyalty, staring with wide-eyed, undisguised glee. He saw the entire social fabric of his world reweaving itself in real time, with him on the outside. Amelia finally looked up, her gaze sweeping across the deck. Her sunglasses were off now, and her eyes, clear and blue, found his. There was no hatred in them. There was no anger. There was something far worse, indifference. It was the calm, pitying look one might give to a stranger who had just made a fool of himself. In that single, fleeting glance, she communicated everything. "You have no power over me anymore. You are nothing." And in that moment, Richard Sterling, the man who thought he had everything understood, that he had lost. Not just his wife, not just his pride, but the one thing he truly valued, the perception of his own importance. He stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage and humiliation, as his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded and dismissed, was escorted into the heart of his kingdom by a man whose shadow was long enough to blot out his sun. The arrival of Amelia and Damien Thorne sent a shockwave through the yacht club, and Richard Sterling was at its epicenter. The immediate aftermath was a study in social physics. People like particles are drawn to centers of mass, and the club's center of mass had just shifted dramatically. As Amelia and Damien were greeted warmly by the club's commodore, a man who had barely given Richard the time of day a week prior, Richard remained rooted to the spot where he'd dropped his glass. A waiter hurried over to clean up the mess, the tinkling of broken crystal a funereal sound. Chloe, her initial shock turning to a mixture of confusion and annoyance, tugged at his sleeve. "Richard, are you going to tell me what's going on?" she demanded, her voice a sharp whisper. "That's your ex-wife. How does she know Damien Thorne? And why is she driving a car that's worth more than our house?" Her questions were practical, transactional. She was recalculating her own position in this new bewildering equation. Her alliance was with power and wealth, and the needle on that meter had just swung violently away from the man whose arm she was holding. I don't know." Richard stammered, his voice hoarse. It was a lie, and a poor one. He knew exactly what was happening. This was a coup, executed with devastating precision. He watched as Damien and Amelia moved through the crowd. They weren't working the room like he did with forced smiles and hearty handshakes. They were a gravitational force. People came to them. Michael Caldwell, who had always treated Richard with a thinly veiled contempt, was now laughing animatedly at something Damien said, his hand clapping Damien's shoulder with a familiarity that made Richard's stomach clench. Patricia Caldwell, who had given Chloe a look of pure disdain earlier, was now engaged in an earnest conversation with Amelia, her expression one of rapt attention. Richard felt invisible. Worse, he felt like a parody. His 70-foot yacht, the Sterling Silver, suddenly seemed small and gaudy. His 24-year-old mistress looked cheap. His own success, which had felt so monumental an hour ago, now seemed fragile and provincial. "I need a drink," he mumbled, finally breaking free from his paralysis. He turned and strode towards the bar, pushing past people with a rudeness born of panic. Chloe trailed behind him, her heels clicking an angry rhythm on the deck. Don't you walk away from me, Richard. At the bar, he ordered a double. His hand trembled as he lifted the glass. He could feel the eyes of the entire club on him, feel their whispers dissecting him. He was no longer the man to be envied. He was the fool, the punchline. The story was already being written, the arrogant developer who cast off his elegant wife only for her to return with a man who could buy and sell him 10 times over. The first direct blow came minutes later. Marcus Elroy, a portly man who managed a major private equity fund, had been a target of Richard's for months. Richard was seeking a massive capital injection for a risky new high-rise project in downtown San Diego. They had a golf game scheduled for the following week to finalize the details. Elroy approached Richard at the bar, his face a mask of polite regret. "Richard," he began, avoiding eye contact. "I'm afraid I'll have to postpone our game next week. Something's come up." "Postpone?" Richard asked, his voice tight. "Marcus, we were supposed to sign the papers." "Yes, well, circumstances have changed," Elroy said finally, meeting his gaze. His eyes flickered for a moment over Richard's shoulder in the direction of Damien Thorne. The message was unmistakable. "The fund is re-evaluating our short-term investment strategy. We're looking for less volatile opportunities at the moment. I'm sure you understand." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply nodded and walked away, making a beeline for the group now huddled around Damien. It wasn't just a postponement, it was a rejection. Elroy had smelled the shift in the wind. Richard was no longer a winning horse to bet on. He was damaged goods. The $10 million capital injection, the lifeblood of his new project, had just evaporated. He stood there, the heavy glass cold in his hand, a roaring in his ears. This wasn't just social humiliation. This was a financial catastrophe in the making. His company was more leveraged than anyone knew. He had been borrowing against the perceived success of future projects to fund his lavish lifestyle. The entire structure was a house of cards built on the perception of his ever-growing influence and success. Amelia's arrival hadn't just knocked over a card. She had kicked out the table from underneath it. Chloe's voice cut through his haze. "What did he mean, less volatile opportunities?" "Richard, is there something wrong with your business?" The fear in her voice was palpable. Her security was threatened. "Everything is fine," he snarled, turning to face her. "Stop asking so many questions." "Don't talk to me like that," she shot back, her voice rising. "I am not your ex-wife. I won't just sit here and look pretty while you ruin everything. People are laughing at you. At us." "Then maybe you should go find someone else to talk to," he said, his voice dripping with venom. He was lashing out the wounded animal, biting at anything within reach. Her eyes widened, hurt and anger warring in them. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stalked away, heading towards a group of younger people by the pool, leaving Richard utterly alone at the bar. He watched her go, but felt nothing. His mind was consumed by a much larger fire. He scanned the crowd for Amelia again. She was standing near the railing, looking out at the water, a glass of champagne in her hand. Damien was at her side, his arm resting gently on her back. For a moment she was alone as Damien was pulled into another conversation. This was his chance. He had to talk to her. He had to understand. He pushed off the bar and began to walk towards her, his movements stiff and awkward. Every step felt like wading through wet cement. The few people who met his eye looked away quickly, as if embarrassed for him. He was a social leper. As he approached, she turned as if sensing his presence. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. It was the first time they had been face to face in almost a year. "Amelia," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Richard," she replied. Her tone was neutral, polite. The voice one uses for a distant acquaintance. It was more painful than if she had screamed at him. "What is all this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the scene at her, at the memory of the Ferrari. "What are you doing?" "I'm attending a party," she said simply. "No," he insisted, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "You and him. This is a game. It's revenge. Amelia took a slow sip of her champagne, her eyes never leaving his. Do you really think my world still revolves around you, Richard? Do you think I would orchestrate all of this for your benefit? You have a vastly inflated sense of your own importance. Her words were like daggers, each one striking a vital organ. You're wrong, she continued, her voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a profound and unshakable certainty. This isn't about you. This isn't revenge. This is my life. The life I built after you did your best to burn it to the ground. The difference between us, Richard, is that my foundation is real. Yours, she glanced around the deck at the fair weather friends and the symbols of hollow status, is made of sand. And the tide just came in. She didn't need to say another word. She had stripped him bare, exposed him, not with anger or histrionics, but with the calm, devastating truth. He had no response. There was nothing he could say to defend himself because he knew she was right. Damien rejoined her, then placing a protective hand on her arm. He looked at Richard, his grey eyes cold and analytical. He didn't issue a threat. He didn't need to. He just looked at him, and in that look Richard saw his own obsolescence. He was an old model being phased out. Damien leaned in and said something quietly to Amelia. She nodded, and they turned to leave. Not in a rush, but with the unhurried ease of people who know they have already won. As they walked away, Richard stood alone, the setting sun, casting a long, pathetic shadow behind him. The party continued. The music played on, but for him it was over. He was a ghost at a feast that was no longer in his honor. The unraveling had begun. The weeks following the summer regatta party were not a sudden explosive demolition for Richard Sterling. They were a slow, agonizing subsidence, the groaning collapse of a structure built on a compromised foundation. The Coronado Bay Yacht Club incident was not the cause, but merely the public survey that declared the building condemned. The story spread through the tightly knit circles of Southern California's elite. Not like wildfire, but like a toxic leak, seeping into every boardroom, every private dinner, every golf game, poisoning the well of his reputation. His professional life, once a gleaming edifice of his own design, began to crumble from the inside out. The withdrawal of Marcus Elroy's $10 million investment was the first visible crack, a fissure, that spiderwebbed through the entire facade of Sterling Enterprises. Richard had always operated on the edge, a high-wire act of leverage and charisma. He built his empire by selling a vision, by convincing people he had an unbreakable Midas touch. But that vision was predicated on an aura of inevitable success, and that aura had been shattered in the reflection of a 1967 Ferrari. He spent his days in his sleek office, the panoramic view of the Pacific, now feeling like a mocking panorama of a world that was moving on without him. The phones, once a constant source of opportunity, grew quiet. When he called out, he was met with a new lexicon of evasion. Longtime associates were suddenly in back-to-back meetings. Bankers who had once fawned over him now spoke in clipped, cautious tones, using phrases like reassessing our portfolio exposure and mitigating risk. A loan extension for his half-finished San Diego high-riser deal he had considered a mere formality was abruptly denied. The official reason was a downturn in market projections. But Richard knew the truth. They no longer believed in him. He was forced to call a meeting with his senior staff. As he looked at their faces around the polished mahogany table, he saw not loyalty, but fear. He saw the same calculation he had once championed, a cold assessment of risk and reward. He was no longer a winning bet. He announced a hiring freeze and the suspension of bonuses. The next day, 2 of his top project managers resigned their letters of resignation, polite but firm. They had been poached by his rival, Michael Caldwell, the man who had clapped Damien Thorne on the back with such gusto. The financial pressure became a physical presence, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He sat alone at night, the silence of his villa punctuated by the chime of his email, each message a new demand from a creditor, or a notice from a supplier halting work. The company that bore his name was bleeding out, and he was trying to staunch a dozen wounds with nothing but his own two hands. His days became a frantic shell game, moving what little liquid cash he had from one account to another, to cover payroll, to keep the lights on, to maintain the illusion of solvency for one more day. The swagger was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man perpetually braced for the next blow. His personal life, the carefully curated stage for his success, offered no refuge. It was merely another wing of the collapsing structure. Chloe, who had been the living symbol of his victory, now became the chief critic of his failure. The final argument was not a passionate explosion, but a cold, transactional audit of their relationship. She found him in his study, staring at a stack of overdue invoices, a half-empty bottle of Macallan at his elbow. "The lease is up on my Mercedes next month," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "The dealership called. They said your corporate account is flagged." Richard didn't look up. "It's being handled." "Is it?" she challenged, stepping closer. "The same way the club membership is being handled. I got a notice today, Richard. A final notice. It's embarrassing." She paused, her voice laced with a newfound contempt. "That man Damien Thorne, I looked him up. He's building a hospital in Africa. He's funding research into clean energy. What do you do, Richard? What do you actually build, besides monuments to yourself that you can't even pay for?" The accusation struck a nerve, raw and exposed. "I gave you everything," he roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "This house, the cars, the clothes. You had no problem with how I made my money when you were spending it. I signed on to be the girlfriend of a winner," she retorted, her voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "Not the last guest at a loser's pity party. I am not going down with you." Her departure was as swift and efficient as a corporate downsizing. While he was out in a final humiliating meeting with his bankruptcy lawyers, she had a moving service clear out her possessions. He came home not to a note, but to the telling emptiness of her closet, the bare spaces on the bathroom counter. The silence she left behind was more profound, more damning than any screaming match. He was alone, a deposed king in a hollow castle. The opulent decor now a constant, mocking reminder of a life he could no longer afford. He was haunted by the echoes of parties he had thrown, of laughter that had been bought and paid for, of a life that had been in the end a magnificent fraud. In stark contrast, Amelia's world was quietly, authentically blossoming. Her consultancy, Hayes Heritage Automotive, had become a respected name in the rarefied world of classic automobiles. The call had come on a sunny Tuesday morning. It was from a curator at a renowned automotive museum in Modena, Italy. They had seen her monograph on Zagato bodywork and were formally offering her the position of guest curator for their upcoming Masters of Italian Design exhibition. It was the job she would have dreamed of before Richard, a position earned entirely on the merit of her knowledge and passion. She told Damien the news over a simple dinner of pasta and wine on the patio of his Laguna Beach home, the sound of the real ocean in the background. He didn't just congratulate her, he celebrated her, asking detailed questions about the cars she'd be working with. His eyes alight with genuine pride and excitement for her. Their relationship was a quiet collaboration, a partnership where her success was as important as his. They found their joy not in public displays, but in shared moments, in long walks on the beach, in debating the merits of a particular artist or engineer, in the easy comfort of a silence that was never empty. She heard whispers of Richard's downfall, of course. A former acquaintance would mention it with pity. A business journal would report on Sterling Enterprises' woes. She felt a distant sadness, the way one might feel hearing of the misfortune of a classmate from long ago. But it did not touch her. Her world was no longer in his orbit. His collapse was a story about him, not about her. Her victory wasn't in his failure, but in her own hard-won peace. The final act of their shared history, took place not in a home they had shared or a restaurant they had frequented, but in the most impersonal of settings, a glass-walled conference room on the 27th floor of a downtown skyscraper that housed the bankruptcy attorneys. The air was stale with the scent of recycled air and defeat. Richard was already there when she arrived. The transformation was shocking. The bespoke suit, once a symbol of his power, hung on him like a borrowed costume. His skin was sallow, his eyes webbed with exhaustion. He seemed to have physically shrunk, diminished by the weight of his own collapse. Amelia entered alone, a figure of calm composure in a simple, well-cut dress. She looked healthy and serene, her confidence radiating not from a sense of superiority, but from a deep well of self-possession. She offered him a curt, polite nod and took her seat across the vast, empty expanse of the table. Their respective lawyers, men who spoke a language of financial ruin, droned on about asset liquidation, creditor committees, and non-dischargeable debt. Amelia signed the documents placed in front of her with a steady hand. It was the final legal severing, the last frayed thread, connecting her to the wreckage of his life. When the paperwork was done, the lawyers, perhaps sensing the monumental weight of the moment, gathered their briefcases and murmured their exits, leaving the two of them alone in the sterile silence. It was Richard who broke it, his voice a dry rasp. "I suppose you're enjoying this?" Amelia looked at him, not with malice, but with a clear, analytical gaze. "No, Richard, I'm not. There's nothing enjoyable about this." A bitter, broken laugh escaped his lips. "Don't lie, Amelia. You must be ecstatic. You did this. You planned it all. That day at the club, it was a perfectly executed assassination." She let the accusation hang in the air for a moment before she answered, her voice even and measured. "You give me far too much credit, and you give yourself far too little. You think my life is still some kind of reaction to you, that I would build something real just to spite you. That's a narcissist's fantasy, Richard." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "That day at the club wasn't about you. It was about me driving a beautiful car with a man I care about, to a place I was invited. It was a single moment of my new life. The fact that it coincided with the collapse of yours isn't my fault. A healthy building doesn't fall down because someone leans against it, Richard. It falls down because its foundations were rotten from the start. You built your entire world on the perception of others, and it was just a matter of time before someone opened a window and the whole house of cards blew away." And he flinched as if struck. He looked down at his hands, at the ruins of his manicured nails. "What am I supposed to do?" he whispered the question, not directed at her, but at the empty room, at the uncaring city below. "It's all gone. Everything." For the first time, a flicker of the man she once married surfaced, the ambitious boy who was terrified of failure, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the hollow shell of the man he had become. "You start over," she said, her voice not harsh but clear and final, a statement of undeniable fact. "The same way I did. You strip away the expensive suits, the cars, the audience. You stand alone in a quiet room, and you figure out if there's anything of value left inside. You find out who you are when nobody is watching. It will be the hardest work you have ever done." She stood, then her chair making a soft scraping sound against the floor. Her part in this tragedy was over. There was no elation, no triumphant surge. There was only a profound sense of closure. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. Amelia walked out of the conference room, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She didn't look back. She crossed the lobby, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and stepped out into the brilliant, unforgiving light of the California sun. The warmth on her skin felt like a benediction. She took a deep, cleansing breath, the city air tasting of freedom. Her victory wasn't the sight of her ex-husband's ruin in her rearview mirror. It was the quiet, absolute certainty of the open road ahead. So what's the real takeaway from Richard and Amelia's story? It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the image you project. Richard built a fortress of arrogance on a foundation of sand, and one wave of truth was all it took to wash it all away. Amelia, on the other hand, lost everything and was forced to build a new life from bedrock. She didn't seek revenge, she sought self-respect, and in doing so, achieved the greatest victory of all, a life of genuine happiness and fulfillment, completely on her own terms. This story shows that the most powerful currency in the world isn't money or status, it's resilience. Have you ever been made to feel small, worthless, like a forgotten chapter in someone else's triumphant story? This isn't just a tale of revenge, it's a story about the quiet, unyielding power of self-worth. It begins in the glittering heart of high society at a gala where a man named Richard Sterling is holding court. He's a peacock in $1,000 suit, his voice booming as he brags about his life, his success, and the beautiful young woman on his arm. The subject of his cruelest jokes, the wife he discarded, Eleanor. He paints her as a pathetic, forgotten woman, but he's about to learn a lesson that no amount of money can buy. The past doesn't always stay buried, and sometimes it returns, not in a beat-up sedan, but in a custom Rolls-Royce with a billionaire at the wheel. The Oakwood Valley Country Club was a cathedral of old money and new ambition, and tonight, at its annual summer gala, Richard Sterling was preaching from the pulpit. He stood near the sprawling ice sculpture of a swan, a flute of champagne in one hand, and his other arm wrapped possessively around the waist of his fiancée, Tiffany Monroe. Tiffany was 24, with hair the color of spun gold and a smile that had been perfected for Instagram filters. She was in Richard's eyes the ultimate accessory, a testament to his post-divorce success. "Honestly, I feel like I've been reborn," Richard announced to a captive audience of fellow investment brokers and their immaculately preserved wives. His voice was a confident baritone that sliced through the polite chatter and the distant strains of a string quartet. "It's like I was driving a sensible, reliable Ford for 15 years. Utterly boring, you know. Did its job, got me from A to B, but zero excitement. Then I traded it in for a Ferrari. Sleek, powerful, turns every head on the street." He squeezed Tiffany's waist and she giggled, a sound like tiny bells. "No offense, darling." "None taken, babe," Tiffany cooed, tilting her head. "I love being your Ferrari." The group chuckled, but a few of the older wives exchanged tight-lipped glances. They remembered Eleanor. They remembered the quiet grace she brought to these events, the intelligence in her eyes that Richard had always seemed so eager to dim. "What's old Eleanor up to these days, anyway?" asked a portly man named Robert Croft, Richard's senior partner. Richard took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne. He loved this question. It was the setup for his favorite punchline. "Eleanor, oh God. Last I heard, she's renting some shoebox apartment downtown. You know that little design hobby she had? The sketches and fabric swatches all over the dining room table. She's trying to make a go of it. Eleanor Vance Interiors, or some such nonsense." He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Can you imagine from this?" He gestured around the opulent ballroom to picking out throw pillows for middle-class housewives in the suburbs. "It's tragic, really." He leaned in conspiratorially. "I was generous in the divorce, of course. A man of my stature has to be. But she was proud. 'I don't want your money, Richard,' she said." He mimicked her voice, pitching it high and reedy. "I want to make it on my own. Noble, I suppose, in a pathetic sort of way. I give her 6 months before she comes crawling back, begging for a top-up on her alimony." The truth, however, was a far uglier story. The 15 years with Richard hadn't been a sensible Ford. They had been a gilded quatorze. Eleanor had met him in college. He was ambitious and charming. She was bright, creative, and saw a future she thought they could build together. She put her own architectural aspirations on hold to support his budding career in finance. She hosted the dinner parties, remembered the clients' birthdays, and cultivated the social connections that were so vital to his ascent. Her silly little hobby was in fact a deep-seated passion for architectural and interior design. Her notebooks weren't filled with doodles, they were filled with detailed floor plans, innovative material concepts, and sketches of sustainable, human-centric living spaces. Whenever she tried to show him, he would wave a dismissive hand. "That's nice, honey," he'd say, his eyes glued to the stock market ticker on his phone. "But let's leave the building to the big boys, eh? Why don't you focus on the guest list for the fundraiser?" The belittling was subtle at first, 1,000 tiny cuts. He'd helpfully suggest a different dress for a party because hers wasn't quite right. He'd correct her in front of friends when she spoke about politics or finance, framing it as a gentle lesson. He'd call her design work cute, a word that felt like a slap. He controlled the finances with an iron fist, giving her an allowance as if she were a child, despite their wealth being built on the foundation of her social and emotional labor. The breaking point wasn't a single event, but a slow, dawning horror. She was 40 years old, looking in the mirror one morning, and saw a stranger. The spark in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. She was a ghost in her own home, a beautifully dressed manager of Richard Sterling's life. That afternoon, while he was at the club, she found one of his burner phones. It was filled with messages to a 22-year-old intern, a girl who would later be replaced by Tiffany. But it wasn't even the affair that broke her. It was the realization that he was utterly incapable of seeing her as an equal, as a person, with a mind and a soul of her own. Leaving was the hardest thing she had ever done. He had been vicious. "You'll be nothing without me," he'd screamed, his handsome face contorted with rage. "You're throwing away a perfect life because you want to play with crayons." She refused the opulent house, the cuz, and the blood money he called alimony. She took only what she had come with her personal savings from before the marriage, her clothes, and her notebooks full of dreams. The world he painted for his friends of a proud, foolish woman was a carefully constructed fiction to mask the truth. She hadn't just left him, she had escaped him. And in that shoebox apartment downtown, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the lingering smell of fear and freedom, Eleanor Vance wasn't picking out throw pillows. She was hunched over a drafting table, the glow of her laptop illuminating a set of blueprints, so audacious, so revolutionary, that they would have made Richard Sterling's world look like a child's sandcastle. She wasn't crawling, she was building. The first 6 months were brutal. The shoebox apartment felt less like a fresh start and more like a prison cell on some days. The hum of the old refrigerator was a constant companion, a stark contrast to the cathedral-like silence of her former home. Every creak of the floorboards in the apartment above was a reminder of how far she had fallen in the eyes of the world she'd left behind. Eleanor poured what little savings she had into starting her business. She built a simple, elegant website showcasing her student portfolio and a few conceptual projects she'd designed in her spare time. She called herself Vance Design Studios, dropping the Eleanor to sound more like a firm and less like a lone, desperate woman. The rejections came swiftly. Established firms saw her as a housewife with a hobby. Potential clients in Richard's circle, whom she tried to contact, either ghosted her or politely declined, no doubt, after a warning call from her ex-husband. She took on tiny, soul-crushing jobs to pay the rent, helping a family pick out paint colors for their nursery, advising on new curtains for a dentist's waiting room. Richard's mocking words echoed in her ears on the lonely bus rides home. Picking out throw pillows for middle-class housewives, she was on the verge of admitting defeat, of taking a retail job at a furniture store when the email arrived. It was terse professional and came from an address she didn't recognize as est.finch at Viridian Dynamics. Com. Subject design consultation. Ms. Vance. Mr. Alastair Finch has reviewed your conceptual work online, specifically the Elysian project. He requests a consultation to discuss the design of a private study and library. An NDA will be required prior to the meeting. Please advise on your availability. Regards, Catherine, Executive Assistant to Alistair Finch. Eleanor stared at the name. Alistair Finch. She had to Google it. The results made her heart hammer against her ribs. Alistair Finch wasn't just wealthy. He was a titan, a visionary tech billionaire who had made his fortune in sustainable energy and then pivoted into revolutionary architectural development through his company, Viridian Dynamics. He was notoriously private, a recluse who hadn't been photographed publicly in years. His projects were the stuff of legend: self-sustaining corporate campuses, eco-friendly residential towers that purified the air around them. He had seen her Elysium project, a conceptual design she had created years ago, a dream of a home that lived in harmony with its environment, using geothermal heating, passive solar design, and recycled materials. Richard had glanced at the sketches once and laughed. Looks like a glorified hobbit hole, L. Who would pay for that? Apparently, Alistair Finch would. The meeting was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't in a stuffy boardroom. She was driven by a silent chauffeur to a discreet address on the coast, a modern but unassuming house cantilevered over the Pacific. There was no sign on the gate, no ostentatious display of wealth. Alistair Finch was waiting for her, not in a suit, but in a simple grey cashmere sweater and jeans. He was older than her, perhaps in his early 50s, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the nervous facade she had erected. There was a quiet intensity about him, a stillness that was the polar opposite of Richard's performative bluster. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm and warm. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the secrecy. I value my privacy." He gestured for her to sit, not across a desk, but in one of two comfortable armchairs by a window overlooking the churning ocean. "Your Elysian concept," he began, getting straight to the point. "It's not just design, it's a philosophy. You understand that a space should not just be inhabited, but experienced. That it should serve the person, not the other way around." For 2 hours, they didn't talk about fabrics or furniture. They talked about light and shadow, about the psychology of space, about the flow of energy through a home. He listened, truly listened, as she explained her ideas, his gaze never leaving her face. He asked insightful questions, challenging her, pushing her, treating her not as a decorator, but as a fellow creator. For the first time in 15 years, Eleanor felt seen. She got the job, of course. The study was a test. She passed with flying colors, creating a space that was both a sanctuary and a powerhouse of creativity, perfectly reflecting the man himself. One project led to another: a guest house, a complete redesign of a corporate retreat in the mountains. He paid her invoices promptly and generously, but it was his mentorship that was the real currency. He gave her access to his resources, introduced her to cutting-edge material scientists and engineers, and championed her vision. Under his quiet patronage, Vance Design Studios flourished. She hired a small, brilliant team. They moved from the shoebox apartment to a sleek, minimalist office downtown. Her name began to be whispered in elite architectural circles, a rising star with a fresh, sustainable vision. Their professional relationship slowly, naturally blossomed into something more. It began with late-night work sessions, turning into long dinners, conversations, shifting from blueprints to life, to dreams, to the scars they both carried from their pasts. He was a widower, his wife having passed away years ago, and he spoke of her with a gentle reverence that made Eleanor's heart ache for the respect she had never known with Richard. Alistair was drawn to her resilience, her fierce intellect, and the passion that Richard had tried so hard to extinguish. Eleanor, in turn, found in him a safe harbor. He wasn't her savior, he was her partner. His wealth was incidental to the man. He was kind, respectful, and genuinely in awe of her talent. He didn't want to dim her light. He wanted to build a bigger stage for it. You know, he said one evening, as they stood on the balcony of her newly completed mountain project, the stars, brilliant in the clear night sky. I'm on the board of the Oakwood Valley Preservation Society. Their annual gala is next week. It's usually a dreadful affair, but I feel obligated to go. He turned to her, a soft smile playing on his lips. I was wondering if you might do me the honor of accompanying me. His blood ran cold for a second. The Oakwood Gala, Richard's kingdom, the stage for her annual humiliation, the thought of walking in there. Then she looked at Alistair's face, at the unwavering respect in his eyes. She thought of her team, her successful projects, the woman she had become. She was no longer the ghost of Richard Sterling's wife. She was Eleanor Vance. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face. I'd love to, Alistair. I think it's time I revisited my old stomping grounds. The air in the Oakwood Valley ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and self-congratulation. Richard Sterling was in his element, the center of a rapt circle. His voice rising and falling with practiced cadence as he regaled them with the story of his life's brilliant second act. It's all about trading up, he declared, giving Tiffany's arm a proprietary squeeze. In business, in life, you have to be ruthless. Cut your losses. Eleanor, bless her heart, she was a loss. A comfortable one for a while, but she lacked vision. She couldn't see the big picture. Robert Croft, his boss, nodded sagely, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. A man needs a woman who inspires him to reach greater heights, not one who wants to retile the bathroom. The men around them brayed with laughter. Tiffany preened, basking in the reflected glory of her man the visionary. She ran a hand down his lapel. My baby is building an empire, she said, her voice breathy. Tell them about the North Ridge project, honey. Richard's chest puffed out. This was his masterstroke. Ah, yes, North Ridge. Sterling and Croft is finalizing the deal on a massive parcel of land just north of the city. We're going to build the most exclusive luxury housing development this state has ever seen. Think gated community, but on a whole other level. Private golf course, equestrian center. We're talking legacy. He lowered his voice, making it sound like a state secret. We're days away from closing. It's going to put us on the map permanently.
Ali,
And he conveniently left out the part where the financing was stretched to its absolute limit, that the deal was precariously balanced on a knife's edge, and that his personal finances were deeply entangled with the project's success. To his audience, he was a king surveying his domain. It was precisely at that moment that the low murmur of the crowd near the grand entrance began to change. The polite chatter faltered, replaced by a wave of shushed whispers and craned necks. A ripple of silence spread through the ballroom as if a switch had been flipped. Richard, annoyed at having his spotlight stolen, turned his head. What's all the fuss about? He grumbled. Through the grand archway, framed like a masterpiece, a scene was unfolding that defied belief. A long, impossibly sleek, custom-built Rolls-Royce Phantom, a shade of deep midnight blue, that seemed to drink the light, had just purred to a stop. This wasn't the standard Mercedes or BMW that littered the club's valet line. This was a car that whispered, not shouted, its owner's status. A uniformed chauffeur opened the rear door. A single, elegant, high-heeled shoe, crafted from emerald green satin, emerged first, followed by a slender leg. Then a woman stood up and turned towards the entrance, and a collective gasp swept up the room. It was Eleanor, but it wasn't the Eleanor they remembered. The timid, tastefully beige wife of Richard Sterling was gone. This woman was a vision. She wore a floor-length gown of liquid silver silk that clung to her form, its simple architectural lines speaking of a confidence that needed no frills or ruffles. Her hair, once kept in a sensible bob, was now a cascade of rich auburn waves swept over one shoulder. A simple but breathtaking necklace of emeralds and diamonds rested at her throat, echoing the color of her shoes. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly serene. Richard's jaw went slack. His champagne flute tilted a few drops, spilling onto the polished floor. Tiffany's perfectly applied smile froze and then tightened her eyes, narrowing, as she took in the woman who was supposed to be a pathetic frump. "My God," Robert Croft breathed his eyes wide. "Is that—" But the true shock was yet to come. As Eleanor paused at the threshold, allowing the room to take her in, a man emerged from the other side of the Rolls-Royce. He was tall and distinguished, his bespoke charcoal suit fitting him like a second skin. He moved with an understated authority that made every other man in the room, including Richard, suddenly look like a boy playing dress-up. He came to Eleanor's side, offered her his arm, and they walked into the ballroom together. The whispers in the room erupted into a flurry of frantic murmurs. "That's Alistair Finch." "No, it can't be. He never comes to these things." "It is him. I saw a picture of him in Forbes." "What is he doing here with her?" Richard felt the blood drain from his face. Alistair Finch, the reclusive, untouchable demigod of tech and development, the man whose net worth was so vast that Richard's entire empire wouldn't even qualify as a rounding error. And he was here with Eleanor on his arm, looking at her, not like a trophy, but with an expression of profound admiration and affection. They moved through the crowd, which parted for them like the Red Sea. They weren't seeking attention yet, they commanded it completely. The alpha energy had shifted in the room, moving from Richard's loud, fragile ego to the quiet, unshakable presence of the man beside his ex-wife. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, calm and cool. They swept past the stunned faces of the women who had pitied her, the men who had dismissed her. Finally, her gaze landed on Richard. She didn't glare or smirk. She simply met his eyes with a look of cool, distant recognition, the look one might give a piece of furniture from a life long past. And in that single, devastatingly neutral glance, Richard Sterling felt himself shrink. His $1,000 suit suddenly felt cheap. His boasts about Ferraris and empires turned to ash in his mouth, and the beautiful young woman clinging to his arm felt less like a prize and more like a consolation trophy. The Queen had returned to the board, and he was just a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The universe seemed to bend around Eleanor and Alistair as they glided towards the center of the room. The string quartet, as if on cue, swelled into a more dramatic piece. People didn't know whether to stare or look away. Richard, rooted to the spot, felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. His carefully constructed reality was fracturing before his very eyes. Tiffany was the first to break the spell of silence in their small group. "Who is that old guy?" she hissed, her voice sharp with insecurity. "And what did she do to her hair?" Richard didn't answer. He was watching his ex-wife, the woman he had called boring and visionless, move with the poise of royalty. He watched as the club president, a man who usually only gave Richard a cursory nod, rushed over to greet Alistair Finch with a fawning deference that was almost painful to watch. Driven by a toxic cocktail of disbelief and wounded pride, Richard knew he couldn't just stand there. To do nothing would be to admit defeat. He had to regain control of the narrative. He straightened his tie, plastered a wide, predatory smile on his face, and began to stride towards them, dragging a reluctant Tiffany behind him. "Well, well, well," Richard boomed, forcing a jovial tone as he intercepted them near the bar. "Eleanor, I almost didn't recognize you. You clean up nicely." It was meant to be a backhanded compliment, a reassertion of his dominance. Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression was placid, betraying nothing. "Richard," she said, her voice even and calm. It held none of the hurt or anger he expected. It held nothing at all for him, and that was somehow worse. Alistair Finch turned his gaze on Richard, and for the first time Richard felt the full force of the man's presence. Alistair's eyes weren't hostile, they were analytical, like a scientist studying a particularly uninteresting insect. "Richard, I'd like you to meet Alistair Finch," Eleanor said smoothly. "Alistair, this is my ex-husband, Richard Sterling." Richard puffed out his chest and extended a hand. Richard Sterling and Croft. A pleasure. Big admirer of your work, Mr. Finch. We're in development as well, though on a more grounded scale. He laughed, a hollow, booming sound. Alistair took his hand in a firm, brief grip. His hand was warm, his grip effortless but solid. Sterling, he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying immense weight. I'm not familiar with your firm. It was a simple statement of fact, but it landed like a punch to the gut. Richard's firm was his identity, his pride. To the most important man in the industry, it didn't even exist. Richard's smile faltered. And this, Richard said, recovering quickly and pulling Tiffany forward, is my fiancée, Tiffany Monroe. Tiffany offered a flirty little wave. Hi, love your car. Alistair gave her a polite, fleeting nod before his attention returned fully to Eleanor. Eleanor, would you care for a drink? I believe they have that sparkling water from the Italian Alps you enjoy. The casual intimacy of the comment was another blow. He knew her preferences. Richard, after 15 years of marriage, could barely remember if she took sugar in her coffee. He felt a hot flush of jealousy that was as surprising as it was intense. So, Eleanor, Richard pressed on, unable to let it go. What's the story? Did you win the lottery? He gestured between her and Alistair. Or did you finally find someone to bankroll your little design hobby? The insult hung in the air, crude and obvious. Several people nearby who had been shamelessly eavesdropping winced. Tiffany smirked, sensing her fiancé was back on the offensive. This time it was Eleanor who laughed. It wasn't the bitter laugh he expected. It was a light, genuinely amused sound. Bankroll, she repeated, a small smile playing on her lips. She turned to Alistair. Did you hear that, darling? He thinks you're my financier. Alistair's expression remained impassive, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. Richard, he said, his voice dropping half an octave, becoming steelier. I am not Eleanor's financier. I am her biggest client. And more importantly, I am her partner. Vance Design Studios is the lead architectural and design firm for Viridian Dynamics' new Terra initiative. The name dropped into the conversation like a 10-ton weight. The Terra initiative was the most talked about, most secretive, and most ambitious project on the planet. A plan to build a series of fully self-sustaining carbon-negative cities. It was the future of architecture, and Eleanor, the woman he'd mocked for her hobbit hole sketches, was the lead designer. Robert Croft, who had sidled up behind Richard, made a choking sound. Vance Design. Your ex-wife is Vance Design, he whispered hoarsely to Richard. Richard's mind reeled. The whispers he'd heard about a mysterious genius firm called Vance Design. He had assumed it was some established German or Scandinavian company. He never, not in a million years, would have connected it to her. Eleanor looked directly at Richard, her eyes clear and strong. My little hobby, as you used to call it, is currently managing a project portfolio worth several $1 billion, Richard. It turns out some people appreciate vision. And she didn't say it with malice, but with a simple, devastating finality. The foundation of Richard's world was not just cracking, it was turning to dust. He had built his entire identity on the belief that he was the successful one, the visionary, and she was the failure. In the space of 5 minutes, that entire narrative had been inverted. He was a small-time developer, hustling for a land deal. She was shaping the future of cities. He looked desperately at Tiffany, seeking an ally, but her face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. The man she'd attached herself to, the one she thought was a titan, was being effortlessly dwarfed. Her Ferrari was suddenly looking like a beat-up used car next to Eleanor's rocket ship. Richard opened his mouth to say something, anything to save face, but no words came out. He was completely and utterly undone. And the worst part was the night wasn't over. The true devastation was still to come. Just as Richard was floundering, searching for a lifeline in a sea of his own, making a new sound cut through the ballroom's hushed atmosphere. It wasn't music or chatter, but the coordinated chime of dozens of smartphones. A wave of notifications rippled through the gala as guests pulled out their devices, their faces illuminated by the screens. Robert Croft's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his brow furrowed with irritation, which quickly morphed into stark disbelief. His eyes widened, and he stared at his screen, then at Alastair Finch, then at Richard. "Richard," Robert whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's a press release from Viridian Dynamics." Richard felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his stomach. He fumbled for his own phone, his fingers suddenly clumsy. He brought up the news alert, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. For immediate release, Viridian Dynamics acquires Northridge property for Phase 1 of Terra Initiative. The headline swam before his eyes. He read it again, and then a third time, the words refusing to make sense. Northridge. His Northridge. The land deal that was supposed to be his legacy, the cornerstone of his entire professional life. The press release went on, quoting Alastair Finch. "The 10,000-acre Northridge parcel represents a unique opportunity. Its topography and natural resources make it the ideal location for the first fully integrated Terra community, a blueprint for sustainable living for the 21st century. We are excited to break ground in the coming months." Richard looked up from his phone, his face pale and slack with shock. He stared at Alastair, then at Eleanor. "How?" he croaked, the single word barely audible. "We were in final negotiations. We had the inside track. The deal was supposed to close next week." Alastair Finch took a sip of his water, his composure absolute. He looked at Richard with an expression that was almost pitying. "You were in negotiations with the Landowners Consortium, Richard, a group of families who have owned that land for generations. You offered them money. You saw the land as a commodity, a blank slate for you to build your gaudy McMansions." He gestured with his glass towards Eleanor, a gesture of profound respect. Eleanor saw it differently. She didn't see a blank slate. She saw a complex ecosystem. She spent months walking that land, studying the watershed, the migratory bird patterns, the old-growth forests. She didn't present the consortium with a lowball offer and a tacky artist's rendering. She presented them with a vision. Eleanor spoke, then her voice steady and clear, cutting through Richard's fog of confusion. "They didn't want to just sell their heritage, Richard. They wanted to see it preserved and honored. I showed them how we could build within the landscape, not on top of it. How we could use geothermal energy from the natural hot springs you never bothered to survey. How a research and education center dedicated to the local ecology could be funded by the project, employing their children and grandchildren for generations. I showed them a future. You showed them a subdivision." The full, horrifying picture began to assemble itself in Richard's mind. While he had been whining and dining, investors boasting about his impending triumph, Eleanor had been quietly, intelligently, and methodically dismantling it from the ground up. She had used the very skills he'd ridiculed: her eye for detail, her understanding of space and environment, her silly hobby, to outmaneuver him on the biggest deal of his life. Viridian Dynamics didn't just offer them more money. Alastair continued, his voice as sharp and final as a judge's gavel. "We offered them a partnership and a legacy they could be proud of. They signed the exclusive sale agreement with us yesterday afternoon. The deal was funded and closed this morning." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Your bid was never even a serious contender. They were just using you to gauge the market rate." Humiliation washed over Richard in a sickening wave. He hadn't just been beaten, he had been played. He was a fool, a pawn in a game so far above his level that he hadn't even seen the board. Robert Croft grabbed Richard's arm, his fingers digging in like talons. "Our primary investors, our credit lines, everything was leveraged against this deal, Richard." He hissed, his face purple with rage. We're ruined. The firm is ruined. Richard stumbled back away from the accusation in his partner's eyes, away from the pity in Alistair's, away from the serene, unassailable strength on Eleanor's face. He looked at Tiffany, and for the first time he saw her clearly. Her face was a mask of cold calculation. The adoration was gone, replaced by a frantic assessment of her own situation. She was looking at him, not as her fiancé, but as a bad investment. A stock that had just crashed to zero. The final piece of his world crumbled. It wasn't just his business that was gone. It was the entire flimsy facade. The crowd was now openly staring their whispers, no longer hushed but buzzing with the delicious, brutal gossip of his spectacular downfall. He was no longer the king of the gala. He was the court jester, stripped bare in the center of the room, his own arrogance the instrument of his destruction. The rest of the gala was a blur of muted colors and distorted sounds for Richard. He felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, not with admiration, but with a morbid curiosity reserved for car crashes. Robert Croft had already abandoned him, huddling in a corner with other board members, their faces grim as they frantically tapped on their phones, no doubt trying to assess the scale of the damage. Tiffany detached her hand from his arm. I think I need some air, she mumbled, not looking at him. She didn't walk. She fled, disappearing into the crowd, a golden retriever abandoning a sinking ship. Richard knew, with a certainty, that chilled him to the bone, that he would never see her again, except perhaps in the tabloids with her next benefactor. He was alone, utterly and completely alone in the wreckage of his own making. Across the room, Eleanor and Alistair didn't gloat. There was no triumphant toast, no pointed glances in his direction. After speaking briefly with a few other guests, who now approached them with a newfound reverence, they simply turned and walked towards the exit, their departure as graceful and understated as their arrival. They hadn't come for revenge. Revenge was beneath them. They had come to attend a gala, conduct a piece of business, and continue with their lives that had simply and consequentially eclipsed his. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of jasmine from the club's gardens filled Eleanor's senses. The chaos of the ballroom felt a world away. The chauffeur held the door of the Rolls-Royce open for them. Inside the car was a cocoon of silence and luxury. The city lights slid past the windows as they pulled away from the country club, leaving the ruin of Richard's life behind them. Eleanor let out a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wasn't giddy or triumphant. She felt calm. The final chain linking her to her past, a chain of insecurity and self-doubt that Richard had forged, had finally been broken. Alistair reached over and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She turned to him, a genuine, unburdened smile gracing her lips for the first time that night. "I am," she said, "better than all right. Thank you, Alistair, for believing in me." "Eleanor," he said, his expression serious, "I want to be very clear. I didn't do any of this for you. I did it with you. The North Ridge vision was entirely yours. Your intelligence, your empathy, your unique perspective, that is what won that deal. I just provided the capital to make it a reality. This victory is yours, and yours alone." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of release. He saw her. He truly saw her, not as an extension of himself or as someone to be saved, but as a brilliant and capable partner. "So," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she squeezed his hand, "what's next for Vance Design Studios and Viridian Dynamics?" Alistair smiled, his eyes lighting up with the familiar spark of enthusiasm she had come to love. "I was looking at that satellite imagery of the Atacama Desert you sent me," he began. "Your concept for harvesting atmospheric moisture for the cooling systems. I think it's time we started sketching out phase 2. As the limousine sped them towards a future of their own design, a future filled with innovation, respect, and shared purpose. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the club's parking lot. His valet had brought his car around a gleaming red Maserati he'd bought to impress Tiffany. Now it just looked garish and pathetic. He had traded in a life of substance for one of style, and now he had neither. He had everything he thought he ever wanted, and in the end, it amounted to nothing at all. He got into the car, the engine roaring to life with a hollow promise of power, and drove off into a future he had never planned, for one where he was completely and irrevocably irrelevant. 3 weeks after the gala, the autumn air turned crisp, stripping the leaves from the oak trees that lined Richard Sterling's once prestigious street. The change in season was a fitting metaphor for his own life, which had been stripped bare with a brutal, astonishing speed. The red Maserati was gone, repossessed by a finance company that was unsympathetic to his sudden financial ruin. His house, a cavernous testament to his former ego, was now an echo chamber of failure. For sale signs dotted the manicured lawn like tombstones. The dissolution of Sterling and Croft had been a bloodbath. When the Northridge deal collapsed, it triggered a cascade of covenant breaches on their loans. The firm leveraged to the hilt folded in less than a week. Robert Croft, in a masterful act of self-preservation, had painted Richard as a reckless, egotistical rogue operator in his depositions, sacrificing his junior partner to the horde of furious investors. Lawsuits were piling up, each one a paper and ink monument to his hubris. He now spent his days in a rented, soul-crushingly beige office above a laundromat, the scent of fabric softener, a constant, cloying reminder of his new station. He wasn't building empires anymore. He was fielding calls from bankruptcy lawyers and negotiating settlements with creditors who wanted their pound of flesh. His former friends from the country club no longer answered his calls. He had been excommunicated from the world that had once worshipped him. His evenings were the worst. Alone in the echoing house with takeout boxes for company, he would torture himself by searching the internet. Tiffany had wasted no time. She was already being photographed on the arm of a German industrialist, looking radiant on a yacht in Monaco. The gossip columns dubbed her a survivor, a woman who had narrowly escaped the clutches of a disgraced financier. The irony was a bitter pill he was forced to swallow every night. But his most obsessive searches were for two names, Eleanor Vance and Alastair Finch. They were everywhere. Forbes ran a cover story titled The Visionaries, featuring a stunning photograph of them standing on a windswept hill, blueprints in hand. The article wasn't about their romance. It was about their professional synergy, hailing Vance Design Studios as the most disruptive force in architecture in a generation. Architectural Digest did a 10-page spread on Eleanor's design philosophy, showcasing her past projects and the breathtaking initial concepts for the terror community at Northridge. They called her style empathetic architecture, a term that made Richard sneer, even as a part of him felt a grudging pang of understanding. One Tuesday morning, he saw an announcement for a groundbreaking ceremony at the Northridge site. It was a private event for investors and press only. An image accompanied the article, Eleanor in a hard hat and practical boots, laughing with a group of engineers, her face alight with genuine passion. She looked younger, more vibrant and more confident than he had ever seen her. She was in her element, not as a hostess or a wife, but as a creator, a leader. Seeing her like that so thoroughly, her own person was a deeper wound than losing his company or his fortune. He had possessed the frame, but he had never once understood the masterpiece within it. A desperate, irrational idea began to form in his mind. He needed to see her. Not to beg or apologize, his pride wouldn't allow it. He needed to see if the woman in those photographs was real. He needed to puncture the myth to find a crack in her new, perfect life. He needed to believe that somewhere underneath the success and the billionaire was the quiet, pliable Eleanor he had once controlled. He found out from a small local blog that she frequented a particular artisan coffee shop in a trendy, revitalized neighborhood downtown, not far from her new offices. It was the kind of place he'd once mocked all reclaimed wood and single-origin beans. Now it felt like enemy territory. He waited for 2 days, sitting in his sensible second-hand sedan across the street, feeling like a private detective in a cheap novel. On the third day, he saw her. She arrived not in a Rolls-Royce, but in a modest electric car, and she was alone. She wore simple black trousers, a soft cashmere sweater, and her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked like any other successful professional, grabbing her morning coffee. He took a deep breath, got out of his car, and walked in. The bell above the door chimed, and her head lifted from the laptop she had open on a small table. Her eyes met his. There was a flicker of surprise, nothing more. No fear, no anger. It was the calm, distant recognition of a near stranger. "Richard," she said, her voice even. She didn't invite him to sit. "Eleanor." He began trying to summon his old, easy charm. It felt like a poorly fitting suit. "Fancy meeting you here. This is, your new spot." "Sometimes," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I have a meeting nearby." The message was clear. "I'm busy. Don't waste my time." He gestured vaguely at her laptop. "So, this is it. The big headquarters of Vance Design. A coffee shop." He meant it as a light-hearted jab, an echo of their old dynamic, but it landed with a thud. "My office is 3 blocks away, Richard. It has 30 employees and a view of the entire city. This," she said, tapping her laptop, "is where I come to think. You'll recall I was never allowed a space to do that in the house we shared." The directness of the blow caught him off guard. The older Eleanor would have absorbed the barb, offered a placating smile. This Eleanor returned it sharpened and precise. He floundered, changing tactics. "Look, Elle, what happened? With the firm, with everything. It was a disaster. I'm ruined." He laid his vulnerability bare, hoping to elicit a spark of the sympathy she had once given him so freely. She looked at him, her head tilted slightly, an expression of clinical assessment on her face. "Yes," she said. "I read about it. It sounded difficult." Difficult. The word was so mild, so detached, it was more insulting than any curse. It was the word one would use to describe a puzzle, not a man's complete and utter ruin. He realized with a sinking heart that she felt nothing for his plight. He was a headline she had skimmed. A desperate, ugly anger began to bubble up inside him. "You did this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You and your billionaire boyfriend. You set out to destroy me." Eleanor closed her laptop with a soft final click. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of emotion in her eyes. It wasn't anger, it was pity. "You still don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice soft but firm. "This was never about you, Richard. North Ridge wasn't a weapon to use against you. It was a project I believed in. Alistair's involvement wasn't a plot to ruin you. It was a partnership born from mutual respect for a vision. You were a business obstacle, nothing more. Your ruin wasn't the goal, it was an incidental consequence of your own poor business practices and your profound underestimation of the market. And of me." She stood up, slinging her bag over her shoulder. She was preparing to leave. He was being dismissed. "You couldn't have done it without his money." He spat, his last desperate gambit. "Don't pretend you're some self-made genius. He bought you this new life." Eleanor paused and looked at him one last time. There was no pity left in her eyes now, only a clear, cold finality. "Alistair's money was the amplifier, Richard," she said, her words striking him like stones. "But the idea, the vision, the design, that was the signal. You lived with the source of that signal for 15 years. You had every opportunity to listen, to engage, to collaborate. But you chose to turn it off, to mock it, to tell it that it was just a silly little hobby. You can't blame the man who finally thought the signal was worth amplifying." She turned and walked away without another word. Through the coffee shop window, Richard watched as Alistair Finch pulled up to the curb. He wasn't driving the Rolls-Royce, but a simple, dark Tesla. He got out, opened the passenger door for Eleanor, and greeted her with a warm, loving smile. They exchanged a few words, and she laughed a sound Richard couldn't hear, but could feel in his bones a laugh of pure, unadulterated happiness. They drove away, merging into the city traffic, moving on to their future. Richard Sterling remained standing in the middle of the coffee shop, his own coffee growing cold on a distant table. He was finally completely alone with the truth he hadn't been destroyed by his ex-wife's revenge or a billionaire's power. He had been rendered obsolete by his own blindness. He was a ghost from a life that no longer existed, haunting a world that had already forgotten his name. Eleanor's story is a powerful reminder that true value is never determined by someone else's opinion. Richard saw her as a forgotten accessory, but he failed to see the architect of her own destiny hiding in plain sight. Her success wasn't about revenge. It was the natural outcome of reclaiming her power, her talent, and her self-worth. It's a testament to the fact that the most powerful empires are not built on money or ego, but on vision, integrity, and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. She didn't need to tear him down. She just needed to build her own world so high that his became an insignificant speck below. What did you think of Eleanor's incredible journey? Have you ever felt underestimated in your own life? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We love hearing from you.